Good afternoon and welcome to UNC Lineberger's Comprehensive Cancer Center's Cancer Conversations. Today we will be talking to Dr. Amanda Corbett. My name is Jennifer Potter and I'll be your moderator. Our topic for this morning is medical marijuana and CBD oil. Dr. Corbett is the Assistant Dean for Professional Curriculum, the Associate Director for Global Engagement, and the Clinical Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina's Eshelman School of Pharmacy. Dr. Corbett is board certified in pharmacotherapy and is a fellow with the American College of Clinical Pharmacy and the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine. She's also a proud yoga teacher and Reiki master and a student of herbal medicine. We really want to encourage your questions today, so at the bottom of every slide there'll be an email address that you could submit your questions as you think of them. We will have plenty of time at the end to address as many questions that we're able to. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Corbett.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. Like Jennifer said, I look forward to hopefully providing some new information to all of you and maybe some review for some of you as well. And also welcome questions at the end, which I would anticipate will be a fruitful conversation that we can have. So just briefly to review what questions I'm hoping to answer for you all today. So first we're going to talk a little bit about what is cannabis in general. So there's lots of terminology. I know it can be quite confusing. It's confusing even for people like myself that's a pharmacist and a pharmacologist, and I can imagine also for consumers that are wanting to know more about these products in this plant. We'll also talk a little bit about how each of these products are regulated or perhaps how they're not regulated. And then finally, hopefully we'll provide you some concrete information about what you should be looking out for and what you should know when you're considering using a cannabis product and purchasing one. Just a brief bit of history to go back. 10,000 BC is the first time that has found to be documented that this actual plant was used, and this was back mostly in Central and Southeast Asia, being used for things like paper and cloth and food. So not really medicinally yet that long ago. It's also been used traditionally in many different religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, the African continent, the Caribbean as well. And then about 5,000 years ago is when we first have seen documentation as use as medicine in Chinese medicine. And in that case, it was not really used of how we might think of it today, and clearly it was used as, or maybe not clearly, at that time it was mostly used as an entire plant. So we know that the way products are manufactured and sold and delivered in the modern society is quite different than how it was delivered in Chinese medicine and even early on in the United States. And I think that's a really important and critical concept to think about. When I started learning about herbal medicine, that was one of the first things that you would have thought I would have understood, but I think was really enlightening to think how traditionally many of these plants are used and then how we have really modified them in the modern world. And when we start to talk about product selection, that's when we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And even in the early 1900s in the United States, we saw that physicians began using cannabis also medicinally. So what is cannabis? So cannabis is actually the plant, the name for the plant, Cannabis sativa. There are other species of cannabis. So there's Cannabis indica, Cannabis reticulata, but the one that we think about mostly in this country and what products are mostly made from, you could think of as Cannabis sativa, which you can see listed here. And then some other common terminology that I'm sure many of you have heard. We can often call cannabis hemp. You may have heard it called marijuana. Cannabis, specifically CBD, cannabidiol. So lots of different terminology that I know makes it a little bit confusing, but as we go through today, I'm hoping to clear that up for everyone. So looking at the graphic here, cannabis sativa is the plant itself. And then you can, at least for our purposes, this plant is really complex. So there are more than 100 different components or constituents of this plant, many of which are cannabinoids. So there's over 100 cannabinoids specifically in this specific plant. So when we talk about marijuana or hemp or CBD or THC, that's really just a couple of the components that we know that are part of this plant. So that goes back to, again, how this plant was used traditionally in Chinese medicine and in other medicines thousands of years ago. You know, they didn't really have the science at that time to say, oh, we know that this is THC or this is CBD in this plant. It was really the entire plant. But just for simplicity, we can divide out our discussion today based on marijuana, which is a common terminology of the cannabis plant that's traditionally been thought of as having THC, or the component of marijuana that causes the psychoactive effect or the high effect. And then this other compound or other component, how you might think of cannabis, is hemp. And any hemp product in the United States legally must contain less than or equal to 0.3% of THC. So THC, and we'll get to this in a moment in more detail, is again that component that has the psychoactive effect. So when we say marijuana, it's going to have a fair amount of THC in it. And when we say hemp, that's going to be a product that will have pretty minimal THC in it. I realize many of you probably cannot see the detail on this slide, but I think it was really interesting to show how traditionally, and even in today's world, hemp is really used for lots of things. So not just medicinally, but as mentioned previously, being used in textiles, as paper products, topical hemp oils for the skin. So lots of different ways that we use it. I originally got a little bit confused about what's this marijuana plant look like, and you hear a lot about the flower or the leaf or the bud or the seed or the stalk, and this may sound very specific, but I think it's important because when you look at products and try to purchase products, you may often want to know, well, what part of the plant is this product coming from? And that will determine how the amount of constituents, either THC or CBD specifically, that might be in that product. So not to belabor this discussion too much, but you can see that the flowers, the buds, the seeds, the stalk, the leaves all have different amounts of these constituents in them. So it really depends on what part of the plant is being utilized and extracted. So to get in the terminology a little bit more, today we're going to talk about CBD and then THC separately. I think it's just easier to think of those separately because they are really different constituents that have very different activities, and you'll also see products that are going to be delineated based on CBD and THC. So what are these things? So CBD is cannabidiol. It's one of the hundreds of cannabinoids or 100 plus cannabinoids that is a constituent of the cannabis plant. CBD specifically comes from the flowers or the buds, the flowers of the plant itself. CBD is usually utilized for hemp or other oils where CBD is being extracted specifically. And CBD oil, which is a common terminology for the products that you'll purchase and might use, is the product that does require less than 0.3% of THC. again, a little confusing, but we'll try to come back to this terminology as we go through the next few minutes. THC is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. It is also a cannabinoid, one of those 100 plus cannabinoids, part of the plant. This is part of the plant, as was mentioned, that does give you that psychoactive or high feeling. And those are, traditionally what we have thought of as marijuana, for example, the component that makes marijuana. There's also hemp oil, which some of you may have seen hemp oil. That's pretty widely available, mostly at specialty stores. I see it more and more around lately. This is oil that's just concentrated from seeds of the hemp plant. This really has very little CBD in it and really should have no THC whatsoever. So these are just often oils that you can use topically on the skin that are available. And again, as to reiterate, the CBD is one of the cannabinoids. There are different medicinal properties of THC and CBD, which we'll get to in just a moment. And they are somewhat different in what they might do for an individual, how they might work. So a little bit about regulation, and I think this is important because as consumers and as healthcare professionals as well, I think it's really important to understand how these products are regulated or how they might not be regulated so well in the United States. And this regulation is constantly changing. It's being discussed almost, it feels like, on a weekly basis. I can tell you there was an FDA hearing just a few weeks ago when I was at the NIH, as a matter of fact. We had just at the NIH spoken about, as the National Institutes of Health, we were having a training on dietary supplements, and that very day the FDA was having a hearing on the legality or not of CBD oil. So this is something that is absolutely on the radar by the federal government as well as state government regulation. So THC is actually only fully legal in 11 states. Now, if you all know something differently, a new state may have popped up since yesterday. That's absolutely possible. But it is only fully legal in certain states within the United States. There's this other sort of categorization of legality of THC. So there's some states, as I've mentioned, that have fully legalized THC or marijuana. There's other states that have that it's completely illegal, so such as in North Carolina. And then there's this sort of in between where it's decriminalized, or meaning that if an individual does possess THC or smoking or taking THC, that the criminalization of it is much less than what it might be in a different state. So this is constantly changing. There is a website that I can provide to you all, but if you Google cannabis government regulation, you'll get lots of great websites that give up-to-date regulation and information about THC. So in North Carolina currently it's not legal. So I'll say most of what I'm going to talk about today I think is pertinent for our audience about CBD, because that is something that any of you can go to almost any town and purchase. So CBD oil is different. It is a Schedule 5 substance. So just meaning that it is not, it's regulated in a specific way other than your regular hypertensive medications or diabetic medications, for example. So it's a little more regulated. It also is quite complex, similar to THC. What made it, I would say, even more complex was the FDA approval of a pharmaceutical agent just last year called Epidiolex. Some of you may have heard of. That medication was FDA approved for very specific seizures in children. Now, there has been more data that's been generated with this specific pharmaceutical agent that we'll talk about in a moment, but currently that's what it's FDA approved for. Interestingly, at the time that this pharmaceutical agent was FDA approved, CBD specifically was not a Schedule 5, it was a Schedule 1, meaning it was technically illegal. So that was, causing a bit of a dilemma of how can this medication be prescribed very easily if it's so controlled. So the FDA had to quickly change that schedule to a Schedule 5, meaning it's still controlled in quite some way, but is not illegal any longer. So what I mean by that is it's not illegal as a pharmaceutical medication, so a prescribed medication. What the FDA does say is that it is not considered a dietary supplement. So as we think of purchasing vitamins and minerals and other herbs such as St. John's wort or garlic or echinacea, those are all considered dietary supplements in the United States, but the FDA does not consider CBD oil to be one. So we're in a really kind of tricky situation where technically, legally, CBD oil is not legal to be sold in the United States. Now, the FDA will say, we're not likely going to go out and, shut down hemp huts or, your local pharmacy that's going to sell CBD oil. But it does put into question what's really happening here, and it gets pretty complicated. So a little bit about THC and how it's traditionally been used for medicine. So mostly with chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, it has been used, and there's some data with that specific indication. As an appetite stimulant as well, especially in HIV patients as well as patients undergoing chemotherapy. For pain, as also for autoimmunity, including Crohn's, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, as well as Parkinson's. So you may see I have a picture here of one of the pharmaceutical agents that is FDA approved, which is a THC product, which is Marinol. Marinol has been around for many years now and is also a scheduled product substance. It can be prescribed by physicians, so it is available. I can say, having experience in the HIV clinic for about 15 years, some of our patients were utilizing Marinol as a pharmaceutical agent for appetite stimulation. However, at least the anecdotal information that I got from a lot of patients was, it's just not the same as taking, smoking marijuana, the whole plant. And I think there's probably some merit to that. Smoking marijuana, the mechanism, as well as it has different constituents in it, probably did have some additional benefit for individuals as opposed to the pharmaceutical agent. However, currently in North Carolina, that is really the only legal way in which you could obtain THC. So shifting to CBD or cannabidiol or CBD oil, there is most data in seizure disorders, and that's really because of the pharmaceutical agent Epidiolex that was FDA approved last year. There is more and more every day. I truly feel like every day there's some sort of additional data, either case reports, case series, animal studies, but really very little randomized controlled clinical trials. So sort of the gold standard that we think about for medications. There's really not a lot of that available for CBD oil, but I do know that there is a lot in the works and in the pipeline. The complexity of that is that scientists, pharmacologists like myself who really want to study this, we're sort of in a tricky situation because, even if we show benefit, technically as it sits right now, CBD oil is not legal. So it does become a bit challenging to try and figure out where is the science going to lead us to clinical application. However, with that, there is some data with anxiety, mostly case reports, very small numbers of patients with pain and osteoarthritis as well as rheumatoid arthritis. These are very small amounts of data. fibromyalgia, back pain, and cancer. And that pain can the pain data is either with oral, so ingested CBD products, or also with topical creams or gel products as well. There's a little bit of data for insomnia. Now, interestingly, for insomnia, depending on the dose of CBD, it may have a stimulating effect, so you may have more awakening and just disturbance of sleep, versus higher doses might actually be more beneficial for sleep. So that does and all individuals respond differently. So it's hard to often know or to predict how an individual will respond for sleep disorders with treatment with CBD. There's a little bit of data in Parkinson's disease, and this is more for not for the motor symptoms of Parkinson's, but more psychoactive symptoms related to Parkinson's, where it has shown some very small amount of benefit. Also in schizophrenia, PTSD, glaucoma, very little bit of data. There's more data with THC for glaucoma than CBD, but I know there's an interest to look at that more closely. And then autoimmune disease, which is something that is very important to me, I think is there's so much potential for treatment of autoimmune disease. I could talk about that for an hour as well. But lots of integrative health approaches to autoimmunity. And I believe that CBD will probably play a role in that in some way. There's just really not a lot of data around that right now. And the little bit of data that we do have, or anecdotal, treatment from individuals that have utilized it for autoimmunity, the CBD oil products that you find on the shelves that you can purchase probably will require really, really high doses to have an effect on autoimmunity. But stay tuned. I'm hopeful that we can have some effect on autoimmune disease also. Just hot off the press, it's not even on the slide here, but something I just came across this week is a small trial that was published, and it's about 40 patients that had a heroin use disorder. And these are individuals that had stopped heroin to some degree within the past month, so really short term. So they had been using heroin not very long ago when they started in the study. So pretty high doses of Epidiolex, so the pharmaceutical agent, was utilized in this study. Really for that drug, about mid dosing for what that drug has been studied for. But they did show some reduced cravings in those individuals, and it did look to be fairly promising as an agent to help individuals with heroin use disorder. Being a pharmacologist and a pharmacist, I could not go without discussing the potential for herb-drug interactions with both THC and with CBD. When people ask me on the street, my friends, my family, people that aren't healthcare professionals, what's your advice on CBD oil? And that's usually what they're asking about in North Carolina. And I say, I think, and these are most people that know me, and I'll say, well, I'm a huge proponent of dietary supplements. I think there's a lot of potential for them. However, for CBD, I do get concerned about the potential for herb-drug interactions. And that's probably the biggest thing that I want consumers to know, is that these can happen. We don't know a lot about the products that are available for purchase, at the local pharmacy or any other store, what those products and what the doses being used for those products, how those might affect pharmaceutical agents. There's really very little information about that. So most of the information that we do have on these potential interactions is from the pharmaceutical agents themselves, and we know that those are quite different than what you can purchase at your local store. So with that said, I would at least provide some overarching overarching recommendations or information about what to look out for with each of these products. So for THC, again, not something you're likely going to purchase at a local store in North Carolina, but perhaps in other states, absolutely. So for THC, it can actually increase effects of opioids, and not just opioids, but many other products. So those of you that understand cytochrome P450 enzymes, if any of you out there are scientists in that sense, the THC does actually increase to cytochrome P450 enzyme activity, so it can inhibit concentrations or increase concentrations of other medications. So that's obviously something you would want to be cautious of and look out for. CBD oil specifically can also do this, so it can also increase concentrations of certain pharmaceutical agents. I could not, on this slide really provide an exhaustive list of all medications for which this can happen, but I did want to provide some overarching classifications of medications for which you may want to, or you should be concerned and cautious about using together with CBD oil. Some of those will be anti-anxiety medications, so things like Xanax or Ativan, antidepressants, the SSRIs such as Zoloft and Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, antipsychotics as well, seizure medications. So there was actually just another study that came out just last week on a different seizure medication, and it was there were pretty significant increases in concentrations of the seizure medication when combined with CBD oil. So that's something to be very cautious about. Blood thinners such as warfarin and others should be cautious. Blood pressure medications, that one's pretty specific for only certain blood pressure medications. But again, it's a little challenging to put all of them here, but at least a question you should ask of, could that have an interaction? What I did not put on here are things like antiretrovirals, perhaps, again, not very common. So those medications that treat HIV patients. Chemotherapy agents, those are so specific that in general, I would ensure that there's at least a conversation with your oncologist or oncology pharmacist before combining these. I, in general, am very conservative with thinking about herb-drug interactions, and it's mostly based on my experience in the HIV clinic for so long. And we did see individuals that were taking dietary supplements, and they did have effects on their medications, which resulted in effects on their disease. So they weren't able to control their viral load or their HIV very well. So because I've seen that before, I tend to be very cautious about recommending any herbal products, and specifically ones that we know have the potential to interact when someone is on other pharmaceutical medications. And especially if you're going to be on them short term, I would, unless you're working with someone who really understands those interactions, I would be as cautious as possible. And then last but not least is thinking about product selection. I think this is, in addition to when those individuals on the street do ask me about CBD, I said herb-drug interactions is something that I do comment on, but secondly, I also talk about the quality of the product and what kind of product is the individual purchasing. The best thing you can do really is to ask or to look online to see if that product has what's called a certificate of analysis. So any of the products that I have ever recommended to anyone, or if anyone asks me what products do you prefer, those are only the ones that I have been able to actually get my hands on the certificate of analysis, or it's often abbreviated the COA. Any company that is not willing to provide that to consumers or to healthcare professionals, I would just be very cautious, and I would not recommend those products to individuals. And this certificate of analysis really just means that the company has tested their product for contaminants to some degree, and also to determine what's actually in the product. So how much CBD is in there, and to ensure that in a CBD oil product that there really is less than 0.3% of THC in those products. Unfortunately, for CBD oil or for any dietary supplements, there's really very few resources for how consumers can determine if a product is reputable or something that you should be taking. So the certificate of analysis would be the best option. But there's also an incredible company called Consumer Lab, and it's at consumerlab.com. You can see their logo here on the slide. I have met them. Their company is outstanding. Access to this site for certain information does require a very small annual fee. I believe it's less than $50, somewhere around $50 a year. So of course I make sure that I renew my subscription to Consumer Lab every year. But this company is an independent company that will not only provides information about certain dietary supplements, but also will test specific products and provide a very clear, I think a very clear description of what they found when they tested the product. So it's an independent testing of dietary supplements. Now, of course, they're not going to test every product available because they have limited resources. But if I'm ever in question of recommending a specific product to a consumer, that's the first place that I go and look and see, did Consumer Lab test, Bluebird's CBD oil, and what did they find? And so consumers can also utilize this site as well. So none of these people pay me, but I know I always get the question of, well, what is that? Which products do you recommend, if you're recommending any? And these are just a few that I'm familiar with. There are many, many others that I just personally don't know much about. Some of you all may know them. And these are ones that I've actually been able to see that certificate of analysis. And even for 3 of them, the 3 on the bottom row there, I've had one-on-one conversations with them, either in person, or all in person, and also over the phone. So I feel very good about their company and about their products. The 2 on the top, I know it's hard to see, and I'll try to provide some additional information about where these came from. The 2 products on the top are just very well known. They were some of the original products of CBD oil. I don't personally know either of the companies, but I've heard lots of good things. I want to say Charlotte's Web might have been one of the first CBD oil products available in the United States. Gaia, for those that care, the one on the far right, Gaia Herbs Hemp, just came out that I saw last week, or a couple weeks ago. And they're actually in Brevard, North Carolina. So I've been there. I know them. Feel very good about their products. They make lots of other dietary supplements as well. So I was waiting and hoping that they were also going to produce the CBD oil product. So with that, that is all I have. So we will see if we have any questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Corbett, for your time today. It was definitely educational and so timely. We had a lot of questions come in. So if you have a couple minutes, we'll do that right now. Okay. One question that came in was, is CBD oil addictive?
Great question. I do not know of any data. Let me just say that. I do not know of any data that suggests that CBD oil is addictive. No, I can't say that. Everyone is different. Everyone's individual. I don't know of any data that shows that.
Okay. And another question came in about urine tests, and if you're going for a new job, and sometimes you have to have a drug screening test.
Yes.
If you were taking CBD oil, would that result in a positive test?
That's a great question, and I get this question quite a bit as well. So there, let me just say it depends is the short answer. Technically, legally, any CBD oil product in the U.S. should have less than 0.3 of THC. So that's really what would pop up in a drug screening would be the THC component. However, if you're not sure that product has that small amount of THC in there, it could show up on a drug screen. Secondly, if depending on how much CBD oil you're ingesting or you're using topically, you could be using, even though it's 0.3%, it's not zero, you could have enough exposure in your bloodstream where it could be positive for THC on a drug screen. So I personally, if there's options of just avoid it whatsoever or just disclose that you are taking CBD oil if you participate in a drug screen. Now, what I don't know, and we actually ran into this quite a bit in our HIV clinic, was we had prescription medications that actually showed up on drug screens as THC, and so we would write a letter to the individual would take a letter to their employer. Usually, that's who it was, employer, to say that this is a possibility. Because CBD oil is not really prescribed or regulated per se. I'm not sure how feasible that is, but it would be interesting. I don't know the answer to that, how you would get around that from an employer standpoint.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is the potential for that to happen.
Okay. And that kind of segues into the different ways that CBD oil is used. And you mentioned creams, and obviously you can ingest it. Someone asked in the audience that she's heard of young people putting CBD oil in vaping devices, and she was curious about the effects of that, how safe or how dangerous it is. So I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I honestly just heard of this myself a few months ago. This was, I would say it wasn't surprising, but there are products specifically that are made to use in vaping as a vape. And I personally don't encourage vaping in general, so let me just say that. I think there's some, localized effects that could be dangerous to individuals. So, you're basically ingesting via your lungs a active ingredient, right? And so absolutely that active ingredient is going to likely have some sort of effect throughout your body. So it's going to be absorbed probably quite readily, because we do know that inhaled marijuana, for example, has a pretty a really good absorption profile, and that's often why people smoke marijuana, right? And so I would not recommend it at all, just because I am a little nervous about vaping in general, so I would not do that.
Yeah.
Was there a question about oral as well, or just vaping?
It was specifically about vaping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Someone asked for your thoughts on how CBD oil and medical marijuana might help or hurt the opioid crisis, and if there's any benefit that you might see as a pharmacist.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great question. Again, I'm a proponent of dietary supplements, herbs in general, so let's start with that. Holistically, I like to think about how can we treat conditions or whatever, either with diet or exercise or some mind-body practice. So let me just say that. However, I realize that's very challenging in lots of situations. So with that, I often try to use any sort of other dietary supplement, plant-based product, if at all possible. And then fifthly, shockingly, as a pharmacist and pharmacy professor, I'm very cautious about using pharmaceutical agents. So with that, I would hope that we are looking at CBD specifically for people with substance use disorders, and the fact that data that just came out with heroin users, I think is really promising. It's not surprising to me based on how we know that these products work. So I'm very hopeful that we will have more and more data on CBD oil specifically. Now, I'll be very honest, I'm not sure about THC in this, for this indication, but I do know that CBD is being studied more and more for this. So I'm hopeful, and I think we probably will see that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. There is a question about UNC, and a lot of the viewers today, we're filming at UNC, and I know a lot of you are watching at UNC, wondered, does UNC, to your knowledge, have a policy about the use of CBD oil, or do you think there should be a policy?
I guess this is concerning employees of UNC. I
don't know.
Yeah, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I do not know of any policy with the university or the health system. So let me just say that I'm not sure. And then my opinion, should there be a policy? I guess what you're getting at is, should there be a policy about, should we restrict individuals that are employed at UNC from using CBD oil? I do not think that. This is my personal opinion. I do not see why that should be. Or we could just say nothing. So there's, it's really tricky. I guess the question would be, is ingestion of CBD oil have some effect on your performance as a healthcare professional? And I would say no more than taking, anti-anxiety medication or any other prescription medication. I think, CBD oil has gotten a pretty bad rap about it having psychoactive effects, and we know it is very, very different than THC or marijuana. So I can't say that loudly enough. It is a very different constituent of the plant. Now, the tricky part is, are we saying it's okay for individuals who are taking something that's technically not legal in the United States? So for that, I could see where perhaps, that might be a policy. I would probably, if there's not a policy, I'm not sure I would step into one at this point, not knowing what the regulation looks like from the federal level. Yeah, but there could be one. I'm not sure.
What about patients who might be admitted to the hospital for cancer-related complications or another disease, and are they kind of allowed to use and bring their supplements or their CBD oil into their care?
There is an army of oncology pharmacists just next door that I'm sure would be happy to comment on that. I haven't done acute care in probably 10 years now, but and I'm sure I'm confident there's a policy in the hospital that, really, in general, it's discouraged for any patients to bring in any of their medications that they're using whatsoever. So, and, I struggled with that as a young pharmacist for a while. I was like, why can't they do that? This is crazy. They've already bought these products. But then you step back and think, well, it's really difficult to understand their care while they're in the care of UNC Health System if patients are able to take whatever they want to take while they're here. Now, there have been times where, if a patient does bring in a product, that it can be labeled and identified and administered by the pharmacy and the nursing staff. But not having been in an acute care setting in some time, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I will say some of my oncology pharmacy colleagues are challenged by the use of dietary supplements along with chemotherapy, and I can absolutely understand that. I was challenged with it in the HIV care setting as well, because mostly the potential of Herbdrug interactions are real and can be really scary if it's not regulated in some way. Me personally, I tend to take the stance of, I would rather know, if you're a patient in my care, I want to know what you're taking, and I want you to be able to feel honest with me about being transparent about what you are taking. So at least I can work with you to say, okay, you're taking, these supplements, and sometimes it's a bag, sometimes it's a few. We prefer the few. But even if it is a bag, bring that in and let's talk about it. Let me try and work with you to understand why is this important for you. And maybe we can, at minimum, try to determine, is it a reputable product? Is there going to be an herb-drug interaction? Like, is this one really a very bad idea because it's going to, decrease the effectiveness of your chemotherapy? Or are these over here potentially safe and we're okay with that? There's national data that shows that consumers and patients in general do not want to tell their provider, either physician or pharmacist, that they're actually taking dietary supplements. And that is something that many of us here at this university I collaborate with really are trying to encourage patients to be more transparent and it not feel like something that is criticized by a patient. Yeah. That was a long-winded answer.
No, that's fantastic.
Something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
A question dovetailed on what you just mentioned. In your presentation, you highlighted that CBD could increase some medications, and you listed antidepressants, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Someone wanted to know if it specifically interferes with chemotherapy, to your knowledge.
That's a great question. So it really depends on the chemotherapy agent. Here's what I would say. If there's an opportunity to, I'm assuming if this is a consumer, for example.
Yes. I want to know, does it help it? Does it hurt it?
Okay. Yeah. It could help it, or what we do know is, if anything, it could increase the concentrations of the chemotherapy. Actually, it could decrease some too. So it really, really depends. I know that's a terribly vague answer, but there's very specific, not to get into a lot of sciencey pharmacology, but it really depends on how the chemotherapy medication is broken down in the body, how it's metabolized. But also some chemotherapy agents have to be activated by these same enzymes. Tamoxifen is one of those. And if, I was just looking at my list, my oncology friends might not be proud of me if I misspeak. So I won't be that specific, but I can answer this later and look it up and be sure. But
Okay.
there are some that are activated that would not be activated, for example, if you took a sufficient amount of CBD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have spoken now for over 45 minutes, and it was a great conversation. I truly appreciate your time.
Sure.
And based on the sheer number of questions that came in, I feel confident saying that the audience appreciates your time too. For those of you who are interested, I've gotten a couple emails about whether or not you could have an actual copy of the presentation. Wanted to let you know that it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel in probably 2 to 3 business days. And if you are looking for the actual slides, when we upload the video, you'll see both Dr. Corbett's profile and the slides. So if that is something you want to rewatch later on, you could either check us out next week or email me personally, and I could send the link to you. And again, that's with that email address on your screen. But thank you, Dr. Corbett, so much for your time today. I just wanted to let the audience know that next month we'll be meeting for Cancer Conversations about nutrition, and we'll have a dietitian here, and she will be talking about organic foods and other ways that we can eat well for good health, and that'll be on Friday, July 26th. So we hope we will see you back then, and thank you so much for your time today. Thank you again.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.